Yes, sure. So my name is Johannes Drielsma, environmental engineer by training, and started my career with the mining industry in Australia. I've spent the last 20 years living in Europe, and most of that spent representing the mining industry towards the EU institutions in what I called earlier the Brussels bubble. And so I think, in my abstract, I'm putting together some ideas which were in part my impressions from the opening session of this week's conference, where I felt that I have attended a lot of events and a lot of conferences about responsible sourcing of raw materials, where from my perspective, an engineer having grown up on site, there's a risk that we still get a little bit stuck in sort of high level discussions of generalizing things, and this contributes to the idea of a bubble in Brussels, or maybe sometimes a Geneva bubble. Yeah, and of course, this is a communication challenge and a consultation challenge when we speak to broad groups of stakeholders, but there is a tendency to sort of narrow things down to two-word labels, usually an adjective and a verb, or an adjective and a noun, sort of responsible supply, sustainable development, green mining. But it feels to me that we've been doing that for a long time, and we might need to get down into some more of the detail and break open some of these generalizations. So a good example, I think, is when I attend events where people speak about what the mining industry should do. And I immediately have the question, well, who do you think is the mining industry? And how would we possibly influence the mining industry? Does it really only include industry, or does it also include informal mine workers, of which there are many? So some of these realities, I think, can spring up when we start to break down some of the generalizations. And probably the same is true when people sit in places like the United States or Canada or Europe and talk about other nations, and what mining countries need or should do, or what host communities need on the ground, without perhaps having visited the ground or spoken to people on the ground or interacted through apps. So I'm very interested in that sort of discussion that we've heard this week about the need to, build trust and introduce some honesty. Unfortunately, our generations are living in a post-factual era, so we have to rediscover honesty, authenticity, intellectual honesty, but at the same time understanding that there are different truths out there. So I'm ready to discuss with you, Sarah.
Fantastic. So Johannes, let's just then pick up on point number, kind of one of those points that you mentioned. So what is mining? So what do we think mining is? And then perhaps let's look at it through a European lens. So what does mining mean in that Brussels or Geneva bubble versus perhaps what does it mean to the broader world?
Yeah, indeed. So I think what would be useful for everyone, certainly in Brussels, to think about is that mining is not necessarily a single industry or a single activity. And mining is very much a human response to a demand for materials. So I'd like to think about it as there has always been, there is today, and there probably will in future be a whole spectrum of actors in the activity of having raw materials from the earth. And that ranges from the top leading mining companies with all the biggest budgets, all the biggest brains in the world, so doing things in very well, and all the way down to, quite frankly, criminal actors. I mean, we have to acknowledge that in some parts of the world, the mafia is involved in mining, or really organized crime. I don't think it's useful anymore to talk about a future where all of mining is only undertaken by these top leading companies that do everything in a perfect way. That's not how it will work. And probably if we want to make the biggest difference on the ground, we need to think more about regulations, tools, ways of communicating, ways of promoting change with everyone in between. So all of those actors in the mining activity that are neither leading companies, neither criminals, but are extracting raw materials out of the earth. So in Europe, the same is true. Perhaps in a broader, a more narrow spectrum, where we don't necessarily have the largest, most dominating mining companies active in Europe anymore. We probably do still have some criminal activity in some parts of Europe, despite the tight regulations. But we have a very, very competent collection of incumbent mining companies that have remained, survived, continued to compete with their international colleagues, and are doing a very good job in terms of running very sustainable, productive mines. So I would encourage more recognition of the diversity, indeed, in the sector.
And do you think that I mean, so within let's just focus in on Brussels here. Is mining in the conversation, or is mining seen as being a negative activity? And I say this from the perspective of, say, COP26, some of those global conferences where mining doesn't have a seat at the table yet for various different reasons. And because it perhaps comes across as being incredibly emotive, very much tied up with coal, for example. Is mining part of the discussion in Brussels, or is it something that is seen as being quite emotive, and so therefore we can't even get into the room, let alone show the diversity of mining?
Yeah, it's a little bit of both. Sometimes those of us who interact with the European institutions might feel that there's a bit of schizophrenia going on. I think stepping back, there are some broad realities at play in Europe, and some broad sweeps of history, if you like. So first of all, mining activity has reduced in Europe. Mining exploration has reduced in Europe. And this is the result of a deliberate political choice by the European countries in about the 1980s. We saw defunding of mining schools. We saw geological surveys no longer supporting exploration, moving to other activities, perhaps more environmentally focused. We saw some governments devolve responsibility for oversight of the mines to more provincial or local level government, who don't have the capacity now to receive, very complicated permit applications from major companies for complicated projects. So we need to recognize that, deliberate political choices were made in the 80s, and Europe is struggling to sort of reverse that trend and come back into the sector. At the same time, in that period, we've seen the fall of the Iron Curtain, and we've seen an accelerated drive to welcome member states in the East and the Southeast that have been formerly under Soviet administrations, where the activity of mining was undertaken very, very differently. Those of us anchored in the Western capitalist world look at some of the operations that were undertaken at that time in that part of the world, and we would say, well, they probably should never have been mined. The ore bodies, the so-called ore bodies that the Soviets were exploiting, would not have got over the line in terms of what we consider viable reserves in a capitalist sense. So Europe is struggling with digesting all of these consequences and visions of mining, and in those parts of the world, it has unfortunately been associated with inefficiency, pollution, and due to the rush to enter the European Union and to sort of come back into the fold, mistakes have been made in terms of how those sites have been looked after and cleaned up afterwards. So that affects the attitude in Europe. And I've lost track of your question, Sarah.
So, well, it's about, I guess, is mining, how is mining discussed within Brussels? But I think just maybe, yeah, do you want to address that?
Yes, there's a double speak at play. So unfortunately, we are at a juncture at the moment where the word mining is not tolerated, I would say, at a certain political level. So in the last couple of weeks, we've seen a lot of really good work coming out and a lot of good research, a lot of good reports explaining the need for raw materials for our green transition, and a lot of buzz on social media. But if you look at the statements made, even by those politicians in Brussels that support this work, they manage to talk about it without mentioning the word mining. So we talk about raw materials, we talk about responsible supply, we talk about supply risk, we talk about diversification, domestic investment, but there's a lot of talk about circular economy and recycling, and a real reluctance to even use the term mining.
So do we need to change the words, or, you know, what do we need to do to fix this? Because this isn't tenable in terms of us just ignoring, you know, everybody who is doing what we know as mining. We need to be able to get that into the room. Is it as simple as just saying, right, we're going to call ourselves that, you know, resource supply or something like that? And we've had various discussions about that earlier in the week.
Yeah, and I've had discussions like that with the industry in the past. You know, do you want to rebrand yourselves as the raw material supply industry? And I got very strong pushback from the people within the industry. They're proud to be miners. I don't know. I think this is wordsmithing, and I think this is dodging the real issue at hand. And that is what we've heard earlier today and from previous panels this week, which is we need to move from the talk to the walk. And we need to make more information available to different parties and have more trust building, more understanding. And I feel quite strongly about the idea that each party, each community should come and explain their mental model, if you like. I think when earlier this week, we talked about business models, mental models, and where the industry perhaps has failed so far or recently is we don't explain enough our mental model or the reasons behind our mental model. And that leaves misunderstandings unaddressed. So I will very often hear statements made by politicians or stakeholder groups or European consumers about the motivations of mining companies, why big corporate companies do the things that they do. And very often, I think this is a misunderstanding. We need to go into those fora and explain, well, the reason that we fund exploration that way, or the reason that we assess mining projects in that way, the reason that we're driven to do things this way is because we are thinking about the resource, the reserve in a certain way. We're thinking about return on investment. We're not necessarily trying to maximize profits, but we are trying to maximize the value of the deposit. And we are open to discussing, to what extent windfall profits in the good times get redistributed to our host community. So we need to explain if not the only truth or the reality, at least our mental model, the way we think about the way our system works. And I think maybe an example to link to the previous talk, I would tend to agree. I think it resonates with me, the idea that the leading companies are very, very good at putting out glossies to address, upwards perhaps some audiences with their reporting, and not so good at addressing the local community. And I recognize that there probably is a fear of losing control. One aspect of that, one element of the mental model of the people in the companies, I think, is that that sort of communication, that control of information is very, very strongly linked to legal risk. Lawyers get involved, security exchange commissions get involved, stakeholders get involved, and this is not helpful. I mean, so they have a role to protect people's funds, basically, but it does get in the way with what we would prefer in terms of engagement with stakeholders. In some countries like Germany, France, Belgium, there are rules around who you speak to and in which order. So you need to be able to show that you've consulted your workers before you've consulted anyone else. And so there are structures in our societies as well that we need to look at in terms of how do we optimize engagement with communities.
Brilliant. Thanks for that, Johannes. So just kind of spinning this round perhaps into a final topic for us to discuss, and that's around all of the minerals and metals and materials that we need for batteries, for example. So let's just focus in on the battery bit for the moment. And so, as you were mentioning, in the 1980s, Europe made the concerted decision to sort of I guess, wind down on the mining side. Meanwhile, China was doing the total opposite, and China was spinning up its minerals and materials strategy. So from a battery materials perspective, of course, now we're thinking, help, where on earth do we get this from in a just manner? And what that means in Europe from a just perspective. Do you have any comments with okay, I say this comments, this could last another 3 hours actually, couldn't it? But any pointed comments, because that will then, I know that Phil and Emma, for example, will be talking about some of these very specific minerals and materials with regards to going into those batteries, etc.
Yeah, and here I guess I have a bit of ambivalence. So the term just transition, it's another one of those sort of generalized terms, but we might use that generalization to our advantage in this case, because I think just is a very sort of value-based term, and therefore each stakeholder will have different ideas about what a just transition looks like, depending on their values and their value system. So it can be a very inclusive term, and we need to make sure that it's more inclusive than it is diluting. Yeah. But I would suggest that in order for the transition to be just, we need to be having dialogue with the different stakeholders to understand what, how inclusive could that term be? Just in terms of trying to avoid societal detriments, the ways of doing things that we don't think fit with our values, at the same time respecting the values of others. Just in terms of who has access to the final products, but then who can also benefit from the production of those final products. So, just to be a little bit provocative, is it just to deploy a global supply chain, have a lot of the processing come through a single country, and then to sort of swallow up and keep to ourselves a kind of, by recycling all of those resources? That's a question. Would it be more just to acknowledge and engage in not only trade of raw materials and products, but also trade of scrap and recyclates, so that everyone can contribute to benefit from all the different steps of the value chain? Is a too restrictive supply chain just in the long term in terms of geopolitical concerns, supply risk, handing disproportionate power to particular countries who might hold the keys to certain supply chains? On the other hand, as I mentioned to you at the beginning of my talk, so long as there's sufficient demand, there should always be openings for new entrants into the market. They might sometimes need government support. So we look at rare earths, for example, where it's clear 10 years ago, most of the production was coming through China. Now, through pretty concerted support from some governments, I'm not sure that's totally well known, but particularly the Japanese government and the Australian government, the proportion of rare earths that are produced outside China is starting to increase. And this is not to be anti-China, but it might be therefore a little bit more balanced, perhaps a little bit more just.
Great. Thank you very much for that, Johannes. As you know, we could carry on speaking all day with regards to this, but thank you so much for bringing into the room the European context, because Europe as a part of the world is incredibly complicated with a huge amount of history. Not to say that other parts of the world don't have history as well, but I think it's something as well where when decisions are trying to be made within Brussels or Geneva, for example, actually all of those member states are sitting around that table, and perhaps we're not necessarily, I don't think it's very easy actually perhaps for, and I say this with a deep breath, those of us who are outside of Europe, my sincere apologies with regards to that. It's quite difficult for us to actually comprehend the complexity with regards to some of that dialogue that is happening within the European Union. So awesome. Thank you so much, Johannes. I know that you're going to hopefully stay with us through the rest of the morning, and we look forward to you contributing to the other talks as well. So brilliant. Thank you very much, Johannes. Brilliant.